Thank you very much. Handing over to you, Ambassador Chinoy. When we look at the multilateral system, is the solution in minilateralism, which is a term sometimes used for the informal groups that we have, the different Gs? Or how do you envisage taking forward the multilateral system to ensure that it is both equitable and inclusive and delivers on sustainable development goals, for example?
Thank you very much. From my point of view, when one looks at a world in considerable disarray, it is important to remember that geopolitical conflicts cannot really be wished away or prevented. What the world really needs to do is to think deeply about the kind of structures that we can create or improve upon that would be better able to either prevent or manage geopolitical conflicts. So therefore, it's instructive to look today at the experience of 100 years ago. When you look at the lessons of the 20th century, for me, it's very clear. The one big lesson is that without the fullest support of major powers, you really cannot have any effective multilateral structure. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was a failure. So was the League of Nations that was attempted in 1920. And it did not succeed because the United States of America was never a member. And you can see that at the height of the League of Nations in the 1930s, between 1934 and 1935, there were actually 58 members, 7 more than the 51 members that created the United Nations in 1945. And yet the League of Nations was a complete failure because it was not able to prevent war, despite the Bryant-Kellogg Pact of 1928 signed in Paris. War could not be prevented. It could not prevent fascism. And therefore, in the 1930s, you could see how firstly, Japan, Italy, Germany, much later in 1939, the Soviet Union, all left one by one. So that's a big lesson for me. The second big lesson is that despite the best of intentions on the part of major powers, you may be creating structures that may not be entirely very helpful or deeply thought through. Take the example of Franklin Roosevelt. Well before the Second World War ended, Roosevelt was speaking about the 4 policemen, that's the 4 sheriffs. He was talking about the spheres of influence that could be carved out by the 4 globo corps, that is the United States of America for the Western Hemisphere, the United Kingdom for Western Europe, China for East Asia and the Pacific, mind you. It's almost like prophetic in many ways, and the Soviet Union to look after East Europe. And this actually, at the end of the Second World War, led to a United Nations that is most inequitable. It started with inequity built into it. So I think best intentions also don't necessarily give you the best results without doing the kind of deep thinking that's required. My second point is that you don't need either minilaterals or maxilaterals. You need something that's balanced. Now take a look at the League of Nations. The League of Nations had no veto power, unlike this most inequitable UN Security Council at the moment. That's totally dysfunctional. And yet it failed. When you look at the G20, it's got the right kind of combination. It's got the BRICS in it, it's got the IDSA in it, it's got the G7 in it, it's got the P5 in it, and there is no veto. There's total equality. With the incoming of the African Union, you have another huge continent coming in. If the if the G20 were $85 trillion, 85% of the global economy of $100 trillion before the AU coming in, the AU has added US dollars 3.1 trillion. Now, I think we have to caution ourselves here that if we have a good dream team like the G20, and you saw that it's a dream team from the unanimity achieved in Delhi, is it necessary then to think closely about other structures, kind of assuming that role and undermining the larger structure? It's food for thought. For example, the G7 must not act like the UN Security Council. nor should it act like the UN Security Council inside of the G20. Similarly, the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, I have a little doubt on that because the new president of Argentina, Javier Milei, has already spoken about, lack of enthusiasm for an expanded BRICS. And when you look at the BRICS with $27 trillion worth of an economy before the expansion, what you have by way of addition is another 3.1 coming in as a result of the 6 new ones, of which 1/3 is, of course, Saudi Arabia. Do we need to have parallel structures, or should we concentrate on the one good A team that we have managed to create, that's the G20? And I don't think I would bank on a grouping like the G77, 135 countries, including China. Frankly, it's too disparate. And these are countries that today face binary choices. They're not in a position to really make their voice felt the same way, precisely because the most important major powers are not part of the G77. So let's concentrate on the G20. This meeting is also about, celebrating what we have achieved so far and taking stock of what needs to be done. Let's support Brazil and thereafter South Africa in making this G20 team the A team. No minis and no maxis required. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Spirit of inclusivity, we would like to take questions from the floor, and so I'd like to ask the remaining 2 panelists to practice the solidarity and time management. Picking up on what we heard on the, we're looking at the question of how we can come up with new ideas, thinking afresh. I'm sure the T20 process has come up with many ideas. We've heard some of them this morning. The panel with the private sector was also very invigorating in that way. Ambassador Chinoy, would you like to maybe highlight a couple of the points?
Thank you. Just because the world is dysfunctional in terms of the multilateral system doesn't mean that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. What we really need to do is to try and improve upon the existing structures that we have. And so the first point is the UN Security Council. It's never been reformed except once in 1965 when the non-permanent category went up from 6 to 10, taking the total number from 11 to 15. And the intergovernmental negotiations since 2007 have gone nowhere. So I think we need to do something about that. The second point is with regard to the MDBs and the IFIs. And I have a view here that when we take a hard look at the IMF and see its lending capacity about $952 billion, of that the SDRs are only $426 billion. The rest is bilateral arrangements or new arrangements to borrow, which really means that once again, the developed countries are basically dictating terms there. And only once in 2007-8 have you seen voting rights being increased and an infusion of about $659 billion being made on a one-time basis at the end of the global financial and economic crisis. So I think the need of the hour is to see how we can expand this financial base that is available, get the IMF, the World Bank to work a little more closely with others like the ADB, the New Development Bank, etc. They work together and yet they don't, which also gives others, that is to say, country-specific banks from particular nations to actually overwhelm everything else. If you take a look at the 4 top banks of the People's Republic of China, you'll find that they have among themselves collectively capital worth roughly, market base there is something like $20 trillion. So if the bilateral track overwhelms the multilateral track, it's not good for the global system. And I think, therefore, we need to work together. The last point I'd make is that military expenditures have gone up by 3.7% year on year recently to touch $2.25 trillion in 2022. And by 2030, the world is going to need $5 trillion annually for climate finance alone. So it's time that we stop fighting wars to divert this capital to developmental finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then please do join me applauding this panel for the excellent comments you've made.